Good afternoon. Okay, we're super excited to be here, and thank you guys so much for coming. Today we're going to be talking about powering the future of clean energy from a really interesting perspective that I think is going to be really exciting. Building the green economy of the future will require at least 3 times the amount of electricity that we generate today. The question of the hour is, how will we meet that demand? Doing so will require unconventional partnerships at unprecedented scale. In that spirit, I'm joined here today by leaders from the public, private, and hard technology services. Please join me in welcoming our panel today. First, all the way down on the end, we have Dr. Katie Huff, Assistant Secretary in the Office of Nuclear Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. Please welcome Katie. We also have April Salas, the Director of Global Sustainability Policy at Microsoft. And lastly, we have Sachin Desai. He's the General Counsel of the fusion company Helion. I'm Tabitha Stein, General Manager of Energy Solutions at Nucor. Nucor is North America's largest and most sustainable steel producer. The green economy is going to be built with steel, and the steel that it's built on matters. For more than a half of a century, we at Nucor have led the movement for sustainable steel, and we're actively building the green economy for tomorrow. From wind farms to solar arrays to green buildings to infrastructure all across our country. As a manufacturing business and a large utility user, we are very acutely aware of the need to find clean power sources for ourselves and for our customers. And we want to help drive down the carbon content of those projects specifically. In fact, as the largest electricity customer in almost every state in which we operate, we are committed to decarbonization at an industrial scale, including science-based targets to be net zero by 2050 and investments in both fission and fusion technologies. As we move forward and as a primary driver for the AI data center infrastructure, which by the end of the decade will need as much electricity as almost 1/5 of the American homes that are out there, I know specifically that Microsoft can relate to the scale of this ambition and that it has set similarly bold climate challenges and goals out there as well. So today, we're really excited to talk about 4 big themes to industrial scale decarbonization that I'm excited to dive into. All right, guys, this is the fun. So as we think about the public and private sectors that are trying to accelerate energy transition and meet the climate targets set out in the Paris Agreement, what is the role of clean energy in our net zero future? And really, why is it so important? And how does this need to happen? Katie?
Yeah, it's important for the survival of our species. I certainly hope that when I'm 80 years old, I'll have a habitable planet. It's not so terribly long from now. It's 42 years from now. I think, so we have to get to net zero. Let's be extremely clear, right? And what's it going to take? We have to deploy an incredible amount of energy, clean energy, and if we don't, there are a few things that can happen, right? 1, we destroy the planet. 2, we stop using electricity and energy in general and go back to the dark ages, right? Or, we build clean energy. That's the only other option. So, I think when we think about what it takes, we have to think about the scale. And for our purposes in the Department of Energy, we see important roles for all kinds of energy technology, renewables, wind, solar, et cetera, but also nuclear power, and clean, firm generation is at the heart of being able to support an incredibly large renewables build-out. Without clean firm generation backing it up, the renewables build-out becomes really untenable in terms of the size and scope and scale that you have to do. So nuclear power, probably we need 200 extra gigawatts between now and 2050 to hit net zero, and we need to do it.
Great. April, anything you'd like to add from Microsoft's lens on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think 2022 marked the 6th warmest year in history, and we continue to see extreme weather causing drought conditions, wildfires, floods, and then 2023 upped the game, and it was the warmest year on record. The IPCC report underscores the importance of and the severity of the climate crisis, but also the urgency in which we need to drive towards collective action. So at Microsoft, we take this very seriously. Our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, and creating a sustainable future is a part of that. So in 2020, I think our goals are pretty famously known, but we announced those bold targets to be carbon negative, waste positive, water positive, zero waste, in a company that protects all ecosystems by 2030. As one of the largest procurers of energy on the planet, we feel that it is absolutely important that we fill that gap with carbon-free energy resources, and that it has to play an important and critical role in the path to net zero.
Great, thanks. And ladies, I'd like to take this a little bit deeper. What will it take to meet our global goals alongside our own in the face of rising energy demand, apart from moving away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, we have to lead in the United States with regard to some of our innovative technologies. A number of nations are waiting for the United States to move in terms of what technologies are the ones that we've deemed to be the most safe and secure and sustainable, and which ones are we investing in that can be cheaper and more accessible for some nations that won't have that kind of investment capability, that don't have that credit worthiness, right? There's a real justice issue in making sure that the technologies we develop for ourselves, we can prove and test here through our innovative commercial system, and then share with our allies for a more peaceful world. I think we've seen extremely clearly over the last 2 years that an errant, powerful nation can take energy and use it as a weapon for all kinds of purposes, but it has been absolutely unconscionable to watch Russia, take access to natural gas away from Europe and things of this nature. We are in a place where democracy itself relies on energy security. Sovereignty itself relies on energy security. And so if we, as a leading nation in the drive toward things like democracy and sovereignty for our partners and our allies, we need to make sure that the technology solutions are available and accessible to those other countries.
That's great. April, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, as a technology company, I think necessarily we believe in the power of technology to help also solve and deploy some of the innovative innovations that we need to see in order to affect this future. In 2020, we also announced the $1 billion Climate Innovation Fund, and we're really excited to announce that, since its establishment, we've invested over $600 million in deploying projects globally, 50 projects globally, addressing the entire spectrum from clean energy to ecosystems and broader. As we see our opportunity as well as a large consumer of energy to operate our data centers, our Scope 1 and 2 emissions continue to decline even though we continue to grow as a company. That said, Scope 1 and 2 for Microsoft are only 4% of our emissions. And so for us, we have a strong commitment towards enabling ourselves, yes, but also our customers and our partners and the world to help effectuate Scope 3 decarbonization. And that's where I think the real opportunity lies, is how we collectively, again, through that collective action, are going to figure out ways to decarbonize our supply chain all the way down into the end user. And so we're really excited about the opportunity to leverage SIF as an important vehicle, investment vehicle, to deploy the technologies that help transform entire markets. But Scope 3 is where we're all going to have to work together.
No, that's great. I think some of the challenges as we think through how we truly make this happen is bringing it to scale. So what strategies or investments do you think are the most promising in helping to source and truly scale clean energy? And Sachin, I'll start with you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? So I might want to take a moment to talk about fusion and the company I work for, Helion. Speaking of investments you can make, I think there are a number of very interesting game-changing investments you can make in this space, and fusion is one of them. So I can't use the next remaining 49 minutes to talk about what fusion is, but at a high level, for those that don't know, fusion is a new approach to making energy. It involves the merging of isotopes of like light elements like hydrogen and helium, putting them together to produce power. It's very similar, essentially the same process that powers our sun. And since the 20th century, we've been trying to bring that power down to Earth. The reasons are obvious. It has the potential to be the holy grail of energy. Clean, dispatchable, firm. Touching on your point as well, the fuel source for fusion is essentially inexhaustible and everywhere. So no single entity can control the future of energy. It's been hard to do so. That's the reason we don't have it today. Now, there's been a rash of 21st century technologies that have helped bridge that gap to make the 20th century concept a reality. Things from modelings to fiber optics to power electronics and semiconductors even. And I can talk about that further later on. But to get to your question, why have people invested in this technology? Why are our strategic partners looking at us? And as an example, Helion itself as one company has raised about $500 million over the last few years to demonstrate electricity production from fusion and then build a plant. Our investors include Nucor, include Sam Altman from OpenAI, as well as Mythril Capital, a large venture firm. But we also have our strategic partners like Microsoft, which has signed boldly the world's first power purchase agreement to put fusion energy on the grid this decade. And the reason they've invested, not to speak for all of you, but what I can distill down is basically two things. One, fusion is that opportunity to be clean, firm power that can put power on the grid, be responsive to various demands, and run all the time. Second, it can scale. So to just dive a little deeper on fusion, you're talking about a technology where you can site it in extremely small areas. A 50 megawatt power plant, like we're planning for Orion, can fit in 30,000 square feet. That's essentially a football field. And it's also a combination of small components. There's no one large thing that defines a fusion generator, but it's a type of technology where you can have all the components come in, they're mass manufactured, you put them on an assembly line, and you can build a generator a day. And that's the kind of output we need to have, unfortunately, to solve the energy crises we're looking at.
That's great, a generator today. I like the way that thinks about that at scale. And so April, from your perspective of Microsoft and in the utilization of this, what are the things that go through your head to make this scalable?
Absolutely. We're really excited about the promise of fusion and the work that you all are leading. I also think, like I said, we're one of the largest procurers of renewable energy in the world, over 19 gigawatts today in capacity. But we know renewable energy isn't going to get us there alone, and we take a multi-technology approach at Microsoft, and so we believe in nuclear, advanced SMRs, fusion, geothermal, solar, wind, obviously, clean hydrogen, but also energy efficiency, storage, and CCUS.
Great, we're all on a journey, right? And taking the little bites out of the elephant is what we're tackling. So what are some of the upcoming policy changes that you can share, or any conversations that are being had that will really help close the clean energy gap that we've been discussing? And Katie, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Yesterday, Congress passed our budget. That's helpful. Was it yesterday? I guess it was the day before. I don't know. I was flying yesterday. It really matters that in that annual budget includes a lot of investment in more nuclear. There's hundreds of millions of dollars for nuclear supply chains, for advanced small modular nuclear reactors. There's $100 million for workforce development that's going to underpin building out some of all of that. And there's $2.7 billion for strengthening our supply chain for enriched uranium. This is a wide and deep audience, but I'll just bore you for just a second to describe what that means. The United States has the largest and oldest fleet of existing nuclear reactors in the world. We operate them safely, and we have historically had the opportunity and capability to make our own fuel for those reactors by mining, milling, converting and enriching it, then fabricating it into fuel. But over time, we've slowly declined in our capability to convert and enrich that fuel in particular. And we've allowed other entities across the world, including, for example, Russia, to take over an incredible amount of that market share. And we continue to currently today, for our existing fleet, which provides 20% of the electricity on today's grid, half of our clean energy generation, 20% of the fuel for that nuclear fleet is currently imported from Russia. In order to get away from that, we must do two things. One, invest in conversion and enrichment capabilities so that we can rebuild our capability to fuel our own fleet. And two, restrict imports from Russia. The appropriations bill has worked closely with DOE and our uranium strategy to arrive at those numbers. And this should give everyone incredible confidence that not only for the existing fleet, but also the higher assay low-enriched uranium required for the future fleet, the United States will be a provider for that, for ourselves and for our allies and partners across the world, so we don't have to rely on Russia for that material. So that's one of the biggest things that's happened this week, is $2.7 billion towards that effort.
Great. And Sachin, from the perspective of the technology that you guys are developing, how does this impact you?
So the policy.
From the policy side, yeah.
So first, actually, I'll say congratulations on the budget. That is extremely uncommon these days, actually. So that is a big accomplishment. I'll start by talking about actually a policy change that's already happened that's worth mentioning. After about many years of evaluation, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is an agency that governs the deployment of both fission and fusion technologies, evaluated fusion technology and decided to regulate fusion under a right-sized, independent, and build its own framework for fusion, as opposed to trying to put it under existing technologies like what exists for fission or others, because fusion is a unique opportunity. And so that's a really important and enabling step for this technology. Now, when we think about scale, which is the theme from the last question, I want to talk about, maybe introduce two concepts that the early conversations that are happening that are going to probably play out over the next decade. The first is, if fusion or any other technology can truly be mass manufactured power, that changes how we think about building energy in the United States. Every energy project traditionally has been this big site project. I used to know the names of every nuclear fission power plant ever built. They're all these like 7-8 year efforts because they're such large installations. But if we can build a generator a day, that model doesn't really work anymore. And so we got to think to the next step. If we're truly going to accomplish this goal, we got to think about what does a mass manufactured licensing paradigm look like. The second is the grid. And it may be possible that the grid in the 2030s looks a lot different than the grid today. Same problem. Let's say we build a generator a day. We can't wait 7 years to get it on the grid, which is actually the current timeline to go through interconnection in the eastern United States. So if we can't do that, we have to look at other alternatives. A lot of that includes siting directly next to industrial facilities, data centers, and the like. And so can you imagine a world where there's just gigawatts and gigawatts of power being built on site next to these facilities? That's very different than how we look at power today, and that's this conversation we're starting.
Yeah, I think from an industrial player like Nucor and I'm sure Microsoft, that excites us as some of the largest electricity customers in the states that we do business. And I think that leads to our next conversation around the concept of partnership. And what is the role of partnership? Because I don't think we can do it alone, right? And so how can government and the private sector, including technology innovators, work side by side to truly enable this future? And what role does the private and public these partners, what role do they play? Katie, I'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So it's the government's job to do a lot of things. I think largely our job is to take on risks that industry alone can't take on, to maintain capabilities that a federal government can maintain, but companies cannot and should not, particularly research capabilities and scientific capabilities, and ultimately, the way that we've been doing this in DOE is through cost-shared awards with companies for technology development, technology maturation in collaboration with the national laboratories. We have an incredible resource in the United States that is incomparable to the resources across the world in our national laboratories. The skills, the capabilities, the technologies, the facilities, they're unmatched in a lot of ways across our whole energy space to a lot of our competitors and colleagues across the planet. And companies can take advantage of those, either through competitive cost-shared cooperative agreements, under funding opportunity announcements and grants, but also under just CRADAs, right? Sort of cooperative research agreements between companies and the labs. You can pay the labs for capability, use. We have a nuclear science user facility system that allows some of our particularly exciting technology capabilities to be accessible to users, science users, right? And that includes things like the Advanced Test Reactor, which can target fluxes of neutrons or gammas or what have you, right at the right spot and size and scope and spectrum. So you can test your favorite material in an operating reactor, take it back out, and tell the Nuclear Regulatory Commission what you learned. The national laboratories can do that, but companies can't and shouldn't, right, do it on their own. That's what governments are for. Governments are also there to help partner universities and national laboratories and the private sector. Universities play this incredible role, and I'm quite biased. I used to be a professor. I'll go back to being a professor when I'm done with this job. And universities play this role of inventing really high-risk, likely to fail, brilliant ideas and testing them out and then seeing some of them fail. And the labs can advance some of the best of those ideas, and private industry can commercialize the very, very best. That's the sort of pyramid of idea filtering that we help to steward in the federal government by funding things like the Kairos reactor as a university project through our university program in NE at its birth, all the way through its initiation as a company and collaborations with the national laboratories until just a few months ago they got a construction permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for their first test reactor. This is a technology that's gone from an idea at a university all the way up through commercialization scale testing. So, that's the role of the government.
April, thinking about Microsoft's role with partnership, what's the lens you guys look at that through?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And as a former government employee, I always love this question where the three legs of the stool come together. Now sitting in this seat, one thing that's really unique is that Microsoft's operating in over 190 countries, but we also view ourselves as customer number one. And so because we are thinking about entire market supporting activities to help decarbonize almost every country, every region of the world, we think of that through the lens as a customer, ourselves, and as ourselves operating in those countries, but also as a customer. We often work very closely with the government to think about how to develop technologies. We also work with the private sector and other partners to help think about how to accelerate those technologies. I mentioned the Climate Innovation Fund, which is spending $1 billion to help accelerate the deployment of these really important and necessary technologies. That form of capital sits alongside where I think government funding maybe would leave off, right? And maybe before the markets are picking up. And so we think that that's a really important source of capital, but also technological innovation. Coming back to customer number one, we've already kind of made the point, that it takes all of us working together. As Microsoft, we have the ability to test certain innovations, certain technologies on our own operations before we deploy them to the rest of the world as a solution that can help empower other companies and other organizations to drive the sort of decarbonization pathway that we are charting. So we feel like it's really important for us to be very engaged with our government partners, our local partners, but also other solutions providers who are leading the way in developing and deploying new technologies.
Yeah, April, that's a good point. And as you think about the needs of industrial scale energy users, what makes Microsoft different from other end users? And as you think about these use cases and why are they important in how you drive clean energy innovation while also anticipating what I expect is exponential growth moving forward for that need?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think more fundamentally, and just kind of level setting with the audience, we kind of think of the traditional duck curve of the two peaks during the day of when demand picks up. in the morning, and then at night when everyone comes back home and turns their lights on. Well, data centers don't sort of operate that way. Our loads are pretty consistent and flat and rather large. So number one, we just have a different load shape and require firm power in a way that's different and unique than some of the variable needs that I think other entities are able to work within. So we think that it's our opportunity to help power our data centers in the most efficient way possible. We think about decarbonize entire grids, which, if we can green the grid by virtue of Microsoft's presence in that location, then we think we're also delivering a resource and a value to the local communities and to the region. But in addition, we have an obligation to think about how to make our data center operations in particular as efficient as possible, from the cooling technologies to the amount of water that we use, and continuing to innovate on the size and scale of the technologies within the data centers. So we're looking at it from both lenses. How do we decarbonize the grids that we operate within, but also how do we make our data center operations as efficient as possible? And I think that's going to be really important as we continue to see AI play a bigger and bigger role in powering many things. I think it's sort of exponential at this point.
That's great. And as we think about clean energy, I think most of us in the room understand solar and wind. And Sachin, what I'd like to ask you about is to kind of think about today renewable energy sources like wind and solar may most likely not support the baseload energy demands of all industries. How is fusion projected to help power the always-on, large-scale operations and energy-intensive businesses that are out there? And honestly, as you think about that, like, understanding from perspective, we've thrown around like how many megawatts are used. Like, how many megawatts is 500 megawatts to actually be able to use by industry?
Great question, great questions. So maybe I'll start with the second one first. What is 500 megawatts? And that number relates to actually a commitment that Helion has made to work with our partner Nucor to build a 500 megawatt power plant behind a Nucor facility around the turn of the decade. And so, from size perspective, in the context of fusion, a 500 megawatt power plant is not a very big facility. Probably fits square footage wise, certainly within the hotel that we're in right now. A 50 megawatt power plant's roughly 30,000 square feet, so we expect not a straight increase, but maybe a few football fields, so to speak, would be a 500 megawatt power plant. What that means is, for example, a 500 megawatt power plant can power, by some estimations, 400,000 homes. That is the entire number of homes I looked up, at least on the plane flight over in Austin. But to also then use that number as the challenge, the city of Austin's home power needs is the equivalent to one Nucor steel mill, and is probably equivalent to a fraction of the data centers that you'd be looking for in the future. And that puts, I think, to me, the scale of the challenge that we need to have. Why do you need fusion, or why do you need this kind of clean, firm power? First of all, because always on. You need something that has to run all the time and when you need it. As well as you kind of need a technology that can fit physically where we've built. Right? We're not moving all the steel mills to new areas. We're not moving all the data centers to new areas. And so you need something that can actually fit in that space. So that's why you're looking at a technology solution that can put the kinds of powers you're looking for in the space that's available, in an already built industrial zone.
That's great. That's great. And as we think about other kind of green, clean technologies that are out there, Katie, I'd like to ask you, what other new green technologies are underrated today, yet show strong potential for providing clean, reliable, affordable baseload power? And I want to focus on that baseload power across industry.
Yeah, well, everything Sachin said about fusion, so much of it is also true about fission, right? We're natural siblings, and generally speaking, we see a variety of scales and sizes being proposed in the fission space. Many of them rely very directly on the conventional power plants of today. For example, smaller, more modular versions of the light water-cooled, uranium oxide-fueled, low-enriched uranium reactors, we would call these, generation 3 plus small modular light water reactors, right? NuScale, Westinghouse AP300, Holtec 300, there's one more I'm forgetting, BWRX 300, right? They're all around this 300 megawatt size. We're talking about the same kinds of markets that require constant, ready-to-run, always-on power, and many sectors that require direct heat. So, the production of hydrogen through high-temperature electrolysis or even thermochemical cycles could require an incredible amount of heat to produce the kind of hydrogen that we would like to see backing up renewables as an energy storage technology. Paper, the production of steels, of course, and a variety of other technologies. For example, Dow Chemical in Seadrift, Texas, has partnered with the Department of Energy and X-Energy, a high-temperature gas reactor, small modular reactor company, to produce a reactor on site at their chemical facility and replace their fossil generation so that they can provide the kind of combined heat and power that they need to make the kind of chemicals that you and I have in every facet of our lives, right? It's the same kind of sizes that we're talking about too, where it's hundreds of megawatts that are needed constantly without fail, regardless of weather, to produce this kind of stuff. And we have a lot of stuff, right? And to continue to live our lives the way we want to live them, certainly we can become minimalist, but it's not going to be enough to get rid of all of the stuff that we need. So we'd love to see this kind of industrial decarbonization as an option for micro, small, and gigawatt scale advanced reactors, whether they're that light water style or a myriad, an incredible variety, a menagerie of different types of other reactors. We have sodium-cooled, that's a metal, not a salt, sodium-cooled, metal-fueled fast reactors like the TerraPower reactor in Wyoming. We've got, which is being built, again, through a DOE partnership. The Kairos reactor that I mentioned earlier, which is pebble, tristructural isotropic fueled, fluoride salt cooled, high temperature reactor at the microscale. You have molten salt reactors, which dissolve the uranium into the salt as a liquid, right? There are a variety of such reactors that are at different stages of technology readiness, but some of them are being built today. And I think we're in a place where the some of them are being built today part gets missed because it just seems like such a variety, a zoo of different animals and technologies out there. Some of them are really on a path to licensing and construction very soon, and I fully expect we'll be seeing it. And so those folks who've been on the investment sidelines, I think, are starting to get pretty excited if they're paying attention.
I think that's the reality is these new technologies are there, but there's a gap between the technology and the actual utilization. And I think it maybe comes down to policy. And so with these new technologies, as is often the case, brand new regulations have to be written to support that innovation. So I'd like to ask all of you, what are some critical policy changes that need to be made to continue to support this energy innovation? And Sachin, I'll start with you.
Well, actually, on innovation, when we think about innovation and policy, right, we think about, oftentimes we'll think about new investments, big new programs, but a lot of innovation is in the down and dirty and the boring parts. You mentioned, for example, the fuel cycle for fission, right? It's such an important area we need to get right in order to have innovation. And that's true here. So when we talk about innovation, the supply chain is actually a really important area to call out. So a fusion power plant is a machine. It's not just burning a fuel source like a coal power plant or something like that. It's got semiconductors, it's got capacitors, it's got reams of wire. We measure our cabling in the unit of megameters, so thousands of kilometers. And so all of that is a complex supply chain that we don't really actually have a strong base here in the United States. We've given up a lot of that power electronics supply chain. And that prevents us from building. And that prevents us from building at scale, but it also prevents us from innovating. So thinking about how we can get ahead on the supply chain issue is critical for innovation.
Okay, April, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft, to be clear, does not develop renewable energy projects. We are an off-taker, so we are a purchaser of renewable energy and carbon-free projects. So we really look to our partners and how to enable the key policies that help enable our partners to develop the technologies that ultimately we would be seeking to take, off-take from. And so we really get excited is the boring stuff, the boring policies. How do we think about transmission and siting a lot of the permitting and licensing, and how we can leverage, Microsoft tools and technologies to help enable an acceleration of, maybe better designed applications, or maybe, easing the reviewer process to that. And so, we really think about ways that we can help enable the partners who are actually out and developing the projects. In some markets, there are technologies that are excluded from corporates to procure from. And, and in those markets, we're typically taking a position of advocating for inclusion of all available carbon-free energy technologies to enable the fastest decarbonization pathway that's possible.
Great, thanks. Katie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'll say that, the Biden-Harris administration in the last few years has executed an incredible amount of policy through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These are historic climate bills. They drive incredible tax credits and direct grants and innovation and cooperative agreements that are already being executed on the ground. But your question was, what needs to change? What needs to be different? And I think Sachin actually pointed it out earlier. The at-factory regulation for mass licensing of, fusion reactors, more like airplanes than airports, right? The way that the FAA, reviews the regulatory experience of an airplane is at the Boeing factory, right? They're checking how it got made, not sort of on site at the airport, whether it's looking good, right? I mean, though they do that too, I think. Right now, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does, as Sachin said, we have this, on-site nuclear regulator observing a single plant at the gigawatt scale, and it's just not going to scale to these smaller designs. You need someone on-site at a factory, a microreactor factory or a small modular reactor sort of assembly plant. This kind of activity is something that the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is already looking at. And so I'm really excited to sort of see what they come up with in the coming years.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to talk a little bit about, we've talked about the concept of scaling, and it really is going to take partnerships. It's going to take industry to accelerate and get these things to kind of become viable for our communities. But think about the role that the companies have for communities, and how do communities stand to benefit? Sachin, I'll start with you.
So when I think about building a fusion power plant, you might think it's a bunch of PhD scientists working in a lab. But this is an industrial project. Our number one staff count is engineers and technicians. For example, we have a building where we do our science, but we also have another building that's a machine shop that has 4 to 5 CNC machines running 24/7 to build components for fusion power plants. And so that's the kind of broad diversity of workforce that we're looking for. And so that's how all communities will benefit from the fusion supply chain in particular. But also, we've been spending this whole panel talking about an energy problem. And communities have an energy problem. What fusion and other clean firm sources can do is bring cheap, abundant energy to all of these communities that are struggling, to industrial America, which wants to build more industry, but can't right now because we're capped on the amount of energy we can get in the first instance, forget just clean energy. So if we can bring fusion to those areas, and we talked about before the size, it's possible to do that, then you can make sure that industrial America can win, not just Silicon Valley. And that's what we're excited about with this technology.
That's great. And April, you talked about Microsoft's footprint, not just in the US, but around the world. And what is that community lens for you guys? Absolutely.
Well, I think, from our markets-based approach, it means that through the process of greening Microsoft, we are hopefully greening the grid and the economy at the local level. A lot of these problems are global in nature, or regional in nature, but the actual work happens at a local community. Microsoft is, through our partner with LinkedIn, has focused a lot as well on skilling. And I think this is a workforce in transition. And so we've published a number of reports, one in particular around closing the sustainability skills gap, helping businesses move from pledges to progress, which really outlines and reinforces the need for the workforce that's going to be required to power the next generation of skills and jobs. And they're not just the traditional engineering jobs. It's marketing, it's finance, it's communications, it's every aspect of the sector, in addition to the technology jobs. and the engineering jobs. And so we really look at the biggest potential upside to this transition is what it can do to help reshape and create green jobs for communities locally all around the world.
That's great. And Sachin, I want to Kate, stay on this topic. What are some successful energy partnerships that you've seen that have positively impacted local communities to date?
So energy partnerships that have impacted and supported local communities. Well, actually, I want to take a second to talk about the partnerships that are in this room. So we have a partnership with Microsoft to build the world's first power plant. We have a partnership with Nucor to build a bigger power plant at a Nucor steel mill. So all of that is around community engagement. We've had the ability to then start to look at sites, to start to work with stakeholders in those communities and talk to them about the opportunity that fusion can bring. And what's interesting about those conversations is that they're not about the nuance. People have come in with big first principle questions like, will there be power? What does this look like? Are there opportunities, economic opportunities associated with that? And so those are the types of partnerships that, having the chance to work with both of you allow us to then have that next level partnership with the community. And I think that's really successful, how these types of partnerships are going to enable us to go the next step with the community.
No, that's great. Katie, a question for you. The energy transition is a cultural change for both businesses and communities. How do we ensure the transition preserves and really ultimately drives the economic growth that's in an equitable manner for all?
The Biden-Harris administration has issued a number of executive orders and driven a lot of policy towards ensuring that there will be energy justice in this transition. And this takes a number of forms, including directing us to spend a lot more dollars in energy-impacted communities, to target certain, regions of the world, regions of the U.S. that have been particularly impacted historically, and it has driven some real policy goals. In the Office of Nuclear Energy, one of the transitions that we see a real opportunity in is the transition from coal communities to nuclear communities. We have done some analysis of all the coal plants in the US, some still operating and, of course, eventually destined to close unless they can do enough carbon capture to neutralize. And many recently retired and retiring coal plants. And we've asked the question, how many of these locations would be suitable for nuclear power? There are real technical reasons you can't site nuclear power in some locations. And we took a look at the seismic issues and whatnot and said, all right, how many are suitable? And it's about 80% of those coal plants across the US. It numbers in approximately the 250 gigawatt range, right? And if you were listening to me earlier, I said that by 2050, we need to add about 200 new gigawatts of nuclear to this grid in order to get to net zero. We've committed to it on the international stage at COP28. We've said we're going to try to get there. We've said that this is the only way we get scale up. It's the only way we successfully support renewables, but it's also the only way we keep entire communities and their revenue stream from their local power plant, the tax revenues associated with the production of energy at that site, the jobs associated with the production of thermal power at those sites. It's the only way we keep those transitions equitable also. We've assessed that there's an incredible economic opportunity. Nuclear sector jobs, especially at nuclear power plants, are about 30% higher than locality pay for similar skill sets because it's, special environment, nuclear energy. And so you often have to have slightly more training or certification, but generally speaking, these plants they're good paying jobs. The same kind of workers that work at coal plants, boiler makers and welders and electricians and steam turbine maintenance, technicians, they work at both coal plants and nuclear plants, right? These are familiar skill sets for operating nuclear power. And so we can transition people and their jobs. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for those of us more concerned about the sort of technological issues around grid transmission and the equity around building a lot more transmission than we may otherwise need to if we were clever, right? building out transmission can really disrupt a lot of communities, and we're going to need to build a lot of transmission, but hopefully we will try to avoid building out more than we need. And one opportunity is to leverage the transmission that's already there, especially those high voltage power lines with significant capacity in the hundreds of megawatts that currently go to coal plants, or rather leave from coal plants. Nuclear power is uniquely dense. In fact, fusion power, this could be the same, right? Everything I say about fission is more or less also translatable to fusion. Let's just be clear. These plants, you can leverage that high voltage power line running straight into the plant. You can leverage the jobs. You can bring communities on board through the transition. You can reduce the cost of building the plant because you don't have to build new power lines to those locations. We estimate about 35% cheaper to build those plants at a retiring coal plant site. So that is how we're going to make it more equitable, is if we focus on those communities that would be particularly suitable for nuclear energy.
Dr. Huff, that's a great point, and I want to ask one more question, and I'll open up to any one of you that want to answer. The World Economic Forum states that people need to be empowered to help drive the energy transition. How do we include the people that are empowered in the process, and what can individuals do to help accelerate this transition? Any one of you?
I'll say in the DOE space, we do have an ongoing process to deal with the spent nuclear fuel question, in which we're using a consent-based process to site an interim storage facility to consolidate the number of locations across the United States where existing spent nuclear fuel is currently stored safely, but currently stored in a lot of locations and not under the title of the U.S. federal government, which we actually promised the utilities we would do when we took their money every time they created a kilowatt hour. And so we're working on a really community-led, equity-focused approach to identifying a location that desires that interim storage facility. And it's an interesting exercise in the kind of consent-based siting we should probably leverage in siting nuclear power plants themselves and eventually in siting a final repository for spent nuclear fuel.
Okay, go ahead, Sachin.
Go for it.
So I think electricity is hard. It's not an area of the world where you come in knowing what you don't learn it from just watching TV. You have to take a distinct effort to kind of dive into it. And that's unfair. That's unfair to the people that we need to serve. And so one thing that we're going to try to do, and I think Katie Huff does a very good job, and the whole Office of Nuclear Energy does an excellent job, is try to educate people about this technology. So the only ask that we could probably put back on is come and ask us. Come and talk to us. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know how people understand fusion. We don't understand how people think about transforming the electricity grid. And it would be wonderful to have those conversations, especially as we start to site our first power plants for Microsoft and for Nucor. That's an excellent time to kind of continue and build community engagement.
Great, great. So I'd like to pivot a little bit and allow you, we've all kind of heard each other answering questions, and give you the chance to ask each other a question. And so Sachin, I'll let you start.
Yeah. Actually, April, we've been talking a lot about, in the US context, the challenges with getting to clean energy and net zero. But Microsoft is ubiquitous around the world. Probably more people have touched a Microsoft product than almost any other product on the planet. So how do you look at this internationally? If you can go a little you mentioned it before, but how does this vary by country? How do you think about the international framework for this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our tendency is to want to group everything together as one big problem and one big solution. It's really the obvious one, which is that's not how we should approach this. The world doesn't have sort of this homogeneous problem that can be solved with a homogeneous solution. There's a lot of difference in regulatory environments, policy frameworks, even how the utility systems are run, the electricity systems are run in different regions and different countries around the world. Even clicking down, if you're comparing US and Europe, there's a lot of similarities, but even going further east into Asia Pacific, we can't even group Asia Pacific as one sort of homogeneous region of the world. And so we've really begun to take a lens of a click down, focusing in on the nation states' sort of uniquenesses. What are the unique policies? Where is the nascency or the development of a particular market? And we should come in and meet that economy where it is. and really think about how to build good partnerships at the governmental level, but also at the local community level, as I mentioned a few times over, because we're operating in so many countries, both in terms of the goods and services we provide, the technology that we enable, but also as just a good neighbor, either siting data centers or physically having a footprint in a given location. So it's really not the sexy and exciting answer. It's really that we have to be careful in not trying to apply a one-size-fits-all solution. We really need to take care and approach things and meet the market where it is.
The theme, it's not sexy stuff. It's the grunt work.
It's the real work, exactly. Well, and Katie, coming over to you, we've talked about the role of clean energy, and I think I may have gotten in one reference to AI on the panel, so I'll turn it to you with the AI revolution. What are some ways that you think AI can help enable or accelerate the clean energy transition?
Yeah, in DOE, we see a lot of applications of AI to science inside the Office of Science. And in nuclear energy, we see a number of applications that are promising around not just the design of things. For example, the shapes of fuels could be informed by generative AI that targets an optimization of the heat transfer of the shape of our nuclear fuel. We've historically been limited to kind of small solid cylinders because of manufacturing capabilities, but as 3D printing and it emerges, we then have an opportunity to optimize for the kind of physics we want. And so who's best at optimizing and generating shapes and things of this nature, if not AI? We have also a lot of attention on things that can help the regulatory process, whether it's digital twinning, sort of a relationship between a digital learning model of a physical system and the actual experimental physical system. We see real opportunity to accelerate some learning around the regulatory process for nuclear reactor technologies there. And we also, I think, are really interested in seeing ways that AI can help nuclear reactor operators as they make decisions. Not make decisions for them, but rather like draw their attention to things that, like your self-driving car might draw your attention to, the other cars next to you. It's you. If you're in control, you're still in control, but drawing your attention to some of those things, I think, may help reactor operators as we think about fleets where there's fewer than one operator per reactor, right? And that's coming if you have very, very, very small reactors, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there, but of course, underpinning it all is that powering that AI has us kind of shaking in our boots in terms of scale. It's going to take a lot of power, as we discussed already. And on that scale question, actually, Sachin, I think, we have this challenge, whether it's fission or fusion or really any energy technology, that you have to get to nth of a kind somehow before you can really reach that runway of like economic capability. So, how are we going to get to, if scale is really what we're after, how do we get to 10 or 20 deployments? What are we going to do to get there?
10 or 20 or 200?
Or 200, yeah. What does it require?
So first, I'm going to touch on the airplane-based licensing that you mentioned before. We got to talk about that after, because that is a key part of it. We can't do site-by-site licensing at any sort of scale. It works for now, but not for solving the problem. I'm also going to take from the coal plant point, right? Like, we need to think about different ways to use the grid. So one option is, of course, siting behind the meter, so to speak, at facilities, but leveraging the infrastructure that already exists that took decades and decades to put together. If we can use that, that's a quick way to add 200, a measly 200 gigawatts, but that's enough to bring us out of the dark a little bit here. And then maybe I'll just touch a bit more on the supply chain point, because I mentioned that was an issue. That's a really interesting area where we're talking about innovation, but I can add maybe a level deeper. For example, Helion's Polaris, our 7th generation device, the one that we plan to demonstrate electricity production from, uses single-digit global capacity of certain types of power electronics. We're talking about a research system, a test system, already kind of stressing supply chains. And if we're talking about 10 or 20, we're talking about building new supply chains from scratch. So Helion, for example, is thinking about, building a power plant. We also have to dedicate immense resources right now to building a manufacturing base. And that's an area where something like how the CHIPS Act looked at logic chips, can that apply to power electronics? When you think about other elements of the DOE that NE operates with, like the Loan Programs Office. How are we thinking about those efforts to really build that supply chain? Because we can't build it once we've built a power plant. We have to build it now. Otherwise, we've built that power plant, and we're going to wait 10 years before we can scale. And the world will get a lot hotter in those 10 years.
So we're closing in on time, and I want to ask each of you one more question. Same question for all three of you. And as we think about, I think there's some big themes that have come up today in terms of scalability and how industry participates, and what's the short-term opportunity, what are the long-term goals that we're going for. I'd like each of you to think about the end of this decade in 2030. What is your vision for clean energy at that point? And then what is your vision by 2050? So 2030 short-term, 2050 long-term. And Session, I'll start with you.
All right. So 2030 is easy in terms of Helion and fusion. We want to have the world's first fusion power plant on the grid delivering power and on our way to building the second. 2050 is probably a little more interesting, right? If the policy changes that we talked about here can come to fruition, we're talking about fusion, clean firm energy fission. We're talking about the technologies that are able to deliver industrial decarbonization, occupying a third, a half of the grid. The sky is unlimited. The ceiling is unlimited. But it's not just about kind of deploying fusion, for example, over other clean energy technologies. We can talk about adding to that, to solving energy poverty, to creating true energy abundance, so that we can, try to achieve the next level of energy that we've been aiming for.
Absolutely.
Great. April, 2030 and 2050.
Ooh. Well, we have a very ambitious set of goals for 2030, so definitely those. No, but in all honesty, I think we really need to be thinking about the enabling policies that are going to need to be put into place today to help enable what we'd like to achieve by 2030. The really unexciting stuff is really around efficiency. It's around reducing loss. And it's also around, thinking about how we design our supply chain with a more decarbonized lens from the beginning. I think, all of those things are going to contribute over time to a future that, by 2050, we would love to see a world where everyone has access. There is no electricity poverty or energy poverty issue anymore. Everyone has access to not just electricity, but carbon-free electricity.
Great. Dr. Huff, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both of these points. I think, in the fission space, I want to see our demo reactors approaching, commercial operations. That's the TerraPower reactor and the X-Energy reactor. I want to see other smaller microreactors reaching commercial demonstration by 2030. They should be on a faster timeline in part because of their size, and I want to see them, starting to make sure that they've got their first of a kind under their belt so they can start building their microreactor factory. By 2050, we need 200 new gigawatts of reactors on this grid, and we need to see a lot of other countries tripling their nuclear power. That's going to take more AP1000s. It's going to take SMRs. It's going to take microreactors. It's going to take everything we've got to support the renewables build out that's going to change the grid fundamentally. And I'd like to see a lot of those reactors happen at coal sites where communities really need that transition to happen.
Great. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. And I know we've really just scratched the surface, so we welcome all of you to continue this conversation with us. Out in the hallway as we wrap, we have complimentary drinks and refreshments outside of this room. Please find us. We purposely put the Q&A in the hallway so we could spend more time having a conversation here. So find us. Bend our ears and let that conversation continue to grow. Come with your questions and we will continue the conversation from there. But before we go, please join me in one last round of applause for our panelists. Thank you again.